Welcome back to Ambivalent Offenders. This is Erin. I am joined by the wonderful, sweet, and intellectual powerhouse that's my husband, Matthew. Hi, Matthew.
I'll try to live up to that. Hi, everybody. I doubt I will, but thank you.
I just like to make you blush before we get started.
Well, my camera's off, so nobody can see me blush. But I am. If you can hear a blush.
I can hear it. We're going to be wading into the topical sphere of oligarchs today. Before there was Bezos, Gates, or Musk, there were titans of industry that made or unmade America, depending on how you feel about them. Names that you might have heard before or seen on buildings around the country. Evidence built into stone of both their largesse and their charitable natures. Gould, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, and more. These robber barons, as they're sometimes called, give us a glimpse into an America that is on the rise. But are they the ultimate villains of that story, or is it more complicated? Are you ready to go back to the Gilded Age today, Matthew?
I'm as ready as I think I will ever be, assuming that we're not living through a second one right now.
Well, that might be part of the questions.
Wind the clock back.
And no, we're not going back to HBO's Gilded Age.
Now, that is a fine show.
We can't decide if we love it or hate it. We do both have matching Bertha and George Russell t-shirts, so maybe that's evidence that we love it.
Should we get this out of the way right now? You know what I'm...
You're... Okay, before we get into the nitty-gritty stuff, Matt's got some beef with Gilded Age, so we'll let him get his rant in before we hop into the history of it all.
So I was never a huge fan of Downton Abbey, but I kind of felt that I didn't really get in on the ground floor there. I didn't watch the earliest episodes of the first season. So when I heard that HBO was going to do a period drama that was basically Downton Abbey in America 20 or 30 years before, I said, okay, let's justify that HBO subscription. Let's really lock into this show. And early on, I noticed that some of the horses used in this show were appearing in multiple scenes in parts of New York that were very far away from one another. I thought maybe the whole thing is CGI, maybe all the backgrounds are fake, but doggone it, Peanut is being asked to cover an awful lot of ground, and then it turned out that they were not, sadly, treating those horses properly.
Matt knew first.
I spotted it right away, and to this day, I'm probably too proud of my keen eye, because I usually miss stuff like that in movies.
HBO is going to come for you.
Yeah.
They're going to think you're the whistleblower. They're going to come for you, Matt. We need to up our security.
I have no idea if that really even merits being in the podcast. It's probably headed to the editing room floor as we speak. But
No. We're going to keep it in because you're going to tell the world that you knew before any of this stuff came out, which suspiciously makes you sound like the whistleblower.
And I will say that the George character on the show does seem to be kind of an attempt to take 4 or 5 different biographical threads from the robber barons and sort of weave them together into a very, he's certainly a handsome robber baron.
He is probably more handsome than some of the other ones. Sorry, robber barons. Yeah, I don't know all of you. I don't know you in your youth, but I'm just going to say probably he's a little bit more.
You don't want to see Gilded Age JP Morgan in a workout onesie the way you might want to see George, doing some...
Oh, you don't know. You don't know what I'm into. Well, I am into Marker Island, so maybe I do. So I've got a type.
Well, in any case, he appears to be an industrialist with a heart, because I was all set to watch him unleash the Pinkertons on his workers at the end of the last season.
I'm assuming that's going to come up in here.
Yeah, that very well could. But I think the way we're going to do this is you told me to just kind of be the wall that you would throw the questions off of, and I would do my best.
Yeah. We're just going to be more Q&A versus straight storytelling. So a little bit different than what we usually do. We're mixing it up a little bit with the formats. Let's start from the beginning. Most of these men came out of the Gilded Age in America, as I already mentioned with the show. So what is the Gilded Age? Can you give us a little background on America during this time? What does it look like? And Obviously, what are the circumstances that allow these robber barons to rise to such wealth and power?
Well, the Gilded Age is sometimes described as the time between the end of the Civil War in 1865 and roughly like 1900, 1901, start of the Progressive Era. There's other historians who typically started like around the late 1870s or early 1880s. But it's a time where you see the country become more urban than rural, although it won't be completely, you won't see the census reflect that entirely until the 1920s. That's when we'll actually have more people living in cities than on farms.
People are increasingly flocking to the city for jobs, like the factory jobs. There's more urban development. Is that what you could say?
Right. And you're starting to see it in parts of the country that don't really have a urban tradition, if you will. Chicago is a great example of this. Chicago in the 1840s and 1850s. I'll pull this up for a second.
Say it the right way. Chicago.
Chicago.
I could say that. I'm a Chicago girly, so I'm not making fun of you Chicagoans. I'm one of you.
Using Chicago as an example, it's got about 30,000 people in it, about 15, 20 years before the Civil War. It has 300,000 people in it 5 years after the Civil War.
Wow.
And by the time you get to 1900, it's over 1.5 million. And by the time you get to...
That's an insane amount of trajectory.
Yeah, and by the time you get to 1920, it's coming up on 3 million. And you would see similar transformations happening all throughout the United States, even though it won't be until that 1920 census that the country as a whole is more urban, rural. That's reflecting the fact that you're also seeing this kind of consolidation, nationalization. The Civil War is over. We have a transcontinental railroad, or to have 4 transcontinental railroads. It's a time where you really start to see economic transformation in the form of not just national, but international marketplaces. It's not the case that we become an industrial power overnight, but definitely this is the time where a lot of the ingredients for that are sort of put into the stew.
It's the railroad that helps a lot of these men. A lot of them are in the steel industry. You know, I'm more of I'm a medievalist. I like my early modern history. This is a little outside of my part, but is that the reason that so many of these men with suddenly huge amounts of wealth, is that what leads them to it, or is it more complicated than that?
It's probably more complicated than that, but there's no way around it. When you looked at the first Dow Jones Industrial Average, like back when it had just 12 companies on it, a majority of them were railroads. And it was because the $5 word for it that would be used today is synergy. I kind of hate that word, but the idea behind it would be that if you're extracting timber, coal, mineral wealth, agricultural commodities out of the West, and you're pushing them across the Mississippi into the East, into this kind of increasingly industrializing urban core that has some roots in the textile industry and pre-Civil War market revolution changes in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, but now it's being ramped up. And suddenly those railroads aren't just the mechanism to extract those resources. Those railroads are also the mechanism to move people and products across vast distances, maybe even to a Pacific shore where you might contemplate markets in Asia. So you start to see, everything from talk of U.S. expansion overseas, the open door policy in China, believe it or not, talk of a potential canal across Central America actually goes back to the 1840s and 50s, but you really start to see that ramp up during this time period. It's just a time of intense economic consolidation. And suddenly you realize that steel in particular, for somebody like Andrew Carnegie, it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. It's in your spoon, and it's in a skyscraper, and it's definitely in a railroad spur. So even though he doesn't start off in the steel industry, because I know at some point you wanted to ask some more specific questions about him.
Yeah.
I think his unique genius is that he realizes that this is kind of the lifeblood of monopolization, of Gilded Age consolidation. You know, steel is really going to be the fuel for this. And if he can become the master of that particular corner of the economy, right?
Unlimited funds, unlimited money.
And he's building on the Vanderbilts start off in ferry service and steamboat transportation. And then they pretty quickly realize that rail will be the sequel to that. And even John D. Rockefeller, who we associate with obviously Standard Oil, his chief mechanism for building Standard Oil was to have secret rebating agreements with the railroads where, unbeknownst to his competitors, he was paying a lot less to ship his oil because after the initial sale was conducted, you know, X barrels for this many miles for this many months, they would have a second meeting where he'd have a different price that would allow him to
sneaky bastard,
radically undercut his competitors.
I did not know that. If you're going to talk about some of the most famous robber barons of the time, I know I listed some of them in the intro. We've hit on a few of them as we've been talking, but let's just kind of expand on that. Who are we talking about when we talk about these oligarchs, these robber barons?
Well, you know, since we just came off that Roman history stuff and they liked triumvirates, the bit three that you...
Who's our American triumvirate?
Well, you know, in some ways they kind of are. It's a strange thing to consider.
Well, they're outside of the law, but they're controlling so much. That's the triumvirate.
Yeah.
Nothing gets done without their seal of approval. So you're saying that it's the same here with the big three.
Right. And the big three would be, and I'm not sure what order to put them, but it would be Carnegie, Rockefeller, and then usually people like Vanderbilt don't quite make that third slot. Almost always it's not a Leland Stanford or a Jay Cook or a Jay Gould. It's always J.P. Morgan, which kind of makes sense because his success and his position is as the financial intermediary for everyone else, because his wealth and power comes from brokerage houses, Wall Street, you know, the financial instruments of the era. That would be my list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, then you have the Vanderbilts of it all, the Jay Gould and some of these other ones that they're still huge, but they're not part of the American triumvirate, if you would want to say. Which one's the Lepidus?
Gosh, I don't think, you know, Lepidus was supposedly kind of passive, right? I don't see any of them as passive.
I know.
I will say that there's a story told. We don't know the extent to which it's historical folklore or not. That in the 1890s, when they felt that their way of life and the corporate empires they had built were in jeopardy because of populist criticism and kind of rising discontent, that they sat down together in a meeting somewhere in New York City and plotted out how they would buy, essentially, the 1896 presidential election.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's one of those statements that's kind of really hard to actually pin down in any kind of like precise, historically defensible form. It's sort of like allegedly when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Cherokee land rights in Western Georgia and Alabama, Andrew Jackson supposedly said, well, that's a wonderful decision, but now let's see if they can actually enforce it. Right. And everybody just takes it for granted that he said that, but we've never actually been able to find a historical source,
I
first
didn't know that.
primary source. There's plenty of secondary sources that claim that he said that, but
And it sounds like something he would say.
it does.
I mean,
Yeah.
come on.
It would fit with our perception of his leadership style. So anyway, there's a story told that, to answer your question, if you're trying to find the Octavian of the whole thing, that it was Morgan who said, no, we're going to have to buy our own president.
Wow. To kind of disentangle that for the listeners, because this is, like you said, we're age of populism, progressive era.
It's too early. It's too early for that.
They're worried about this antitrust sentiment, that kind of thing. That's why they want their guy in the White House.
Well, yeah, because you're going through this period where, and it's just kind of strange if this worked out this way. This is not where I should be in class right now with my kids. We should be a little bit farther along in the chronology, but we've had so much strange weather here in the upper Midwest that we've just now been studying this. So in the 1870s, 1880s, there emerged a movement called the Grange, which was a kind of rural farm protest movement that really felt, to a certain extent, betrayed by the federal government. The Homestead Act had made it possible for people to settle the Trans-Mississippi West. The transcontinental railroads were not laissez-faire capitalist enterprises. They were all built with federal government aid. Hundreds of millions of dollars.
That sounds familiar. Lots of money from the federal government funding these people.
And now suddenly they found themselves having to fall back into sharecropping, tenant farming, because they couldn't afford their mortgage. Or if they could pay the mortgage, they could barely pay the mortgage. And oftentimes the same company that controlled the bank just happened to have controlling shares in the railroad that shipped their crop back east. If you ever got a little break on the interest rate, it seemed like the freight rate would go up. And of course, they're all kind of sentencing themselves to a supply and demand crisis, because as Kansas and Colorado and the Dakotas, as the far west is settled and as agricultural output goes up, they're kind of drowning in supply, which is pushing prices down. That's a little paradoxical for us to wrap our heads around. But remember, for somebody who's producing commodities, they need prices to go up. They need eggs to be more expensive. So anyway, by the 1890s, they realized that maybe the Democratic Party is not the answer. Maybe the Republican Party is not the answer. Maybe they should start their own third-party political movement. And then as part of that, they realize, kind of going back to our Chicago example, that increasingly, not quite half, but an ever-growing percentage of the country is steel workers, coal miners, people. As late as the 1950s, 1 out of every 5 Americans still in some way, directly or indirectly, worked for a railroad.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, my family members, and I know your family.
Oh, so absolutely.
That checks out in terms of anecdotal evidence.
It's just the reality. I mean, they were the original corporation. Railroads established the original corporate template that all other large businesses followed because, for obvious reasons, they were the first businesses in the United States or anywhere in the world that really had to contemplate in real time, because of things like the telegraph and eventually the telephone, and obviously the speeds that they could cover. They had to contemplate in real time costs, wages, productivity. If I want to build a new line between Duluth and Seattle, how many bridges do I have to build? How many cars do I have to build? All those kinds of calculations that dominate corporate America's Microsoft Excel spreadsheets today, they were first done in pencil in the 1870s and 80s.
Those poor workers,
Right.
those poor workers. No, you don't even have Excel to help you.
Yeah.
Or Clippy. No Clippy to help them.
Yeah, the disembodied eyeball on Clippy would not have been there to help them. So you get to the 1890s, and in Omaha, the Omaha platform of the Populist Party, to try and reach out to urban workers, the populists pitched this idea that, well, maybe we should have a federal 8-hour workday law. Maybe we should have aggressive antitrust legislation. Maybe we should outlaw child labor. Maybe we should adopt an income tax. And then maybe the proposal that probably scared people like Carnegie and Rockefeller and Morgan the most is they argued, and this is something that you'll see again when we get to like radio and television. They argued that, well, if the railroads were originally built with massive federal government subsidies, and if they are like an essential element of how California interacts with Kentucky and how Maine interacts with Mississippi, then maybe what we should do is just have the federal government take over all the railroads and just run it like
federalization.
Just run it like the post office. So if you're trying to get from Chicago to St. Louis, it's going to cost you exactly what it would to get from, say, Omaha to Denver, right? Where corporate America, understandably, would push back and say, well, now, wait a minute.
Mm-hmm.
The traffic between Omaha and Denver is not going to be as heavy as the traffic between a Chicago and a St. Louis or something. We should be able to adjust the rates accordingly. And now you're realizing, oh, God, that's the same debate we have over the interstate highway system. That's the same debate we have over, should Verizon be allowed to merge with this cable provider or this satellite company? You know, is my cable provider secretly slowing down Netflix because they
it all goes back to this.
Literally does. Some of the case law does go all the way back to this. So anyway, yeah, supposedly in the 1890s, to defeat populism, the three of them gathered together as a kind of Gilded Age Roman triumvirate to preserve corporate America against this insurgency. And they won, sort of, because that election happened twice. That was the McKinley-Bryan election.
Oh, okay. Which, for people who don't know, McKinley was assassinated.
He was assassinated. And so in the summer of 1901, that allowed Teddy Roosevelt to ascend to the presidency.
Teddy! Yeah, and Teddy was not a fan of these guys, and they weren't a fan of him, if you could.
Well,
it's
more complicated than that.
I know it's more complicated than that, but
no. What was it? Yeah, definitely. He, as an old wealth kind of patrician New Yorker, Roosevelt name had traction in New York society back when New York was New Amsterdam. Prior to the British seizure of the colony. But usually this is one of those things where you push your glasses up against your nose and say, actually me, that's fine. It was Taft. It was his successor, Taft. Taft went after more trusts than Roosevelt did. It was under Taft that Standard Oil actually got broken up. Now, the reason that Roosevelt is usually seen as a trust buster, and I think this is fair, is that he's still the one who initiates it. He's still the one who says, it's time for this to be part of our agenda. But in his head, he seemed to have kind of a little T-chart of good trusts and bad trusts. And any trust that he felt had built itself up through, efficiency and cleverness, not like Rockefeller style grifting cleverness, but Carnegie, he felt, should, by that point, Carnegie had sold out Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan. So it was U.S. Steel by that point. But Roosevelt actually did not want to see U.S. Steel prosecuted as a monopoly, even though it very obviously was.
Well, I guess you can make parallels to modern day, where obviously there are some companies that get a pass on this kind of thing and others that do not. I could certainly see some parallels in our modern day society.
I can't. I see no parallels whatsoever.
You are blind to it now.
It's just my job is just to present the facts.
Well, okay. Next question. So the reason some of these men could be called ambivalent offenders, because right now they sound pretty bad, I think, to most of us. They're making their wealth off the backs of ordinary Americans. Their business practices aren't the things that we would love nowadays. Child labor, underpaying your workers. But they did engage in a lot of philanthropy as well as being just real sons of bitches. They did a lot for the arts and culture in America. Can you tell us a little bit about that side of robber barons, some of those accomplishments?
Well, there's multiple schools of thought about how this happens. I guess the cynical interpretation is that they know from their reputations in the press that in some cases, they are just absolutely despised. And they don't want to do what we might today recommend they do to rehabilitate their image, which would be, well, why don't you adopt labor contracts that don't allow you to employ people under the age of 16? Or why don't you voluntarily embrace an 8-hour workday instead of a 10 or 12-hour workday?
No, why would we do that? Why would we do that? How about a museum?
Right. That's the standard, like the Carnegie model would be you basically can't throw a rock in this country and not break a window at a Carnegie library. They're all over the place. In fact, that's kind of an awkward, weird Google search you can do is just if you just punch in Carnegie Library and sale or repurpose or closure, you'll find that there's all these beautiful properties throughout the country that, sadly, libraries have really come upon tough times in the last 50 years that get turned into breweries and shopping outlets or condos. But yeah, it was his ambition. He articulates this in the Gospel of Wealth, that the whole purpose of acquiring wealth and riches and status is so that you can earn it back to society in your later years. But what I've learned is, in the time that I've taught this, the conventional wisdom was that for someone like Carnegie, his desire to do this comes from 1892 specifically, and the tremendous regret he feels after the Homestead steel strike, which he's conveniently not in the country for. He's in Scotland when it happens, but he knows it's going to happen.
Should we talk about that now? Or
Well, I think we can just sort of plant it and we can circle back to it.
okay, remember that. So he's got regret over that. We will hear why he has regret over that in a little bit.
But it turned out to be the case that once his children and grandchildren became, well, in some cases died, but as their records, as the historical evidence kind of attached to his extended family moved into the public domain, right around 1970, there was this amazing biography, the Wall biography of Andrew Carnegie, which is just called Andrew Carnegie. And it pretty much stuck to that story that he was haunted by what he had to do, what he felt he had to do to build Carnegie Steel into this amazing corporate empire, which, remember, by the time, well, I say remember, but I haven't said it yet. By the time you get to like right around 1900, and this is not a publicly traded company. This is all in command of one checkbook. He's producing more steel than the entire British Empire.
Wow.
That's one of those lines that makes it into every book and every PBS documentary. But what the more recent scholarship has shown, like in 2005, 6, somewhere around there, the Nassau biography came out, NASAW, which is also conveniently called Andrew Carnegie.
We don't need to be creative with our titles. Just give it to us.
And for listeners, I know there's probably some listeners going, don't you mean Carnegie? It's like, no, it's Carnegie. That is the Scottish pronunciation. But that book argues that as early as the 1850s, Carnegie felt like he had to be remembered as a champion of labor rights and egalitarianism. And there's a whole theory that some of this, to kind of reconnect to history that I know you're more comfortable with. I know my discomfort with the ancient stuff spikes up again when we get into English history, because I'm not as well versed in that. But Carnegie did have on his mom's side, Margaret's side, his grandfather, Margaret's dad, was a Chartist, somebody who advocated for labor rights, as early as some of the periods of textile poverty that we associate with, like the Luddite Rebellion, things like that.
Yeah, so people who are fighting for
workers' rights.
Really early, like 1830s, early 1800s.
Right.
I think.
And then there's a certain irony to this too, because and you're right, maybe we are going too far, but Carnegie's father was a weaver. And there was this cycle that I don't know that Andrew necessarily was cognizant of this. I don't know. I have to think that by the time he was older, he came to understand this. The first good that became mass produced, the first truly industrial product, it was textiles. And the first thing you have to mass produce, whether you're using wool or cotton, is thread. And usually that's where you kind of hit a bottleneck, because it's one thing to pull together the technologies that we associate with the first industrial revolution to spin thread, everything from the cotton gin to something literally called a spinning jenny. And I think listeners have probably seen these drawings of English textile mills where you just see this hum of water powered. There's a wheel with water, rotating a central axle through the whole mill, and then hundreds and hundreds of spindles that some poor child has to reach into whenever the drive belt is disconnected, and you pull the thread off. And we, of course, look at it today and go, oh, that's pretty primitive. That's technology. That seems pretty far removed from an iPhone. But then you have this bottleneck where it's like, well, that's great. I have a spindle of thread. I don't have anything I can actually wear. It's not a garment yet, right? So then it has to be woven. And eventually, sadly for Carnegie's father, some of the technologies that allowed for that to happen. And we're not talking about weaving into a finished garment. We're talking about weaving into sheets of cloth that will eventually be cut and stitched into a finished garment. But that intermediate process, which was a highly prized skill, that was what his father was an expert craftsman. Eventually, in the 1840s, the power loom made his father's occupation pretty much obsolete. And that's what drove the family to the United States in the late 1840s, 1848. If you think about that process, that's very similar ultimately to what he's going to do with steel. He's going to find mechanisms to automate and expand the production of steel and take all sorts of skilled craftsmen who worked with steel as a hybrid byproduct of iron work. We would look at it today and say, oh, are they blowing glass? It's like, no, they're not blowing glass, but it's a very similar kind of skill where you have to be able to sort of by experience, by instinct, by intuition, by having done this through your whole life, you have to assess, when it's time to pour, when it's time to shape, when it's time to fire. Is the color of this molten metal what I need it to be for the ultimate product that it's going to be turned into when it cools and hardens into the mold? And he found mechanisms to turn all of that into a kind of automated process.
It's age-old story of automation, automation taking away, jobs.
And so his workers, unwittingly, they were participating in the process that would put them out on the streets in much the same way that those people that ran those looms, every motion that they undertook was studied. If there was a way to do it with a machine, that would be the breakthrough that would allow for production to expand, but would eventually lead to the attrition of the workers.
Yeah, sorry, we don't need you anymore. Thanks for everything. Here's your last paycheck.
If you've ever caught yourself in the middle of a conversation with a customer support specialist, like a chat somewhere, trying to get your cable TV to come back on or get a EOB corrected on a medical bill, and you started to ask yourself halfway through the conversation, is this really a person on the other end? Is there really a Cynthia in Phoenix who is helping me? Or is Cynthia
probably not
a robot? It's the same old story.
We're fighting the same fights that we've been fighting for over a centuries at this point.
So anyway, the short answer is that he probably wanted to do the gospel of wealth thing as a product of regret. over the way he built Carnegie Steel, but there's some scholarship that says it was kind of a part of his worldview going all the way back to when the family lived in poverty during his childhood. In fact, most of the robber barons I don't think any of them really have roots as humble as his, but I think that's part of it. That's part of their ambition too, is they don't want to just be seen as these sort of predatory robber barons. They want to be seen as like the founding fathers of a new American Revolution, except during this American Revolution, we're going to become the economic titans of the new world.
And that's what you see, if you go to North Carolina, you've got what is it, Biltmore, Vanderbilt House. You've got Vanderbilt. I don't know. Does Jay Gould give back? I don't know much about him.
Less so. He's actually one of the robber barons that's seen as sort of unabashedly. He doesn't try and hide.
I'm just a capitalist. I don't know what you guys are doing. Why would I found a museum when I could buy a bunch of good shit? But then Rockefeller, obviously in New York, Rockefeller's a big name. Lots of buildings and endowments and such.
You've got a lot of contributions from Rockefeller for medical research.
Was there a reason to do medical research?
I don't know if they were all involved in providing grants for universities.
So I think a lot of people, when they hear the names, they probably engaged with these names via a university.
Right. And even Carnegie himself had a business partner, Henry Clay Frick. They had a serious falling out later in life because Carnegie kind of blamed Frick for Homestead. Although, again, we have private letters indicating now from the Nassau biography that maybe it wasn't quite as ugly a breakup as it looked. Frick was famous for funding the arts. You have a lot of museums that kind of have their core collection comes from him. You mentioned Vanderbilt. Obviously, in Nashville, there's a legacy there.
One big legacy, just a university,
right.
Whatever.
Carnegie Mellon University, of course.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Mellon was active in finance, and actually Mellon helped to broker the final sale, quote unquote sale, of Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan. That was the man who dies rich dies disgraced. That was Carnegie's model.
Do you think he lived up to that? I know he does give away a huge amount of his wealth, but when you're already that hugely wealthy and it's towards the end of his life where it's like, well, you're not going to need it as much. You're still leaving on a huge amount of money for your kids, your grandkids, your family.
Well, he had a really horrible problem towards the end of his life, which is his own accountants told him that there was no way he could give it away prior to his death because it was earning interest at a rate that it just couldn't keep. The projects could not be identified and the money couldn't be allocated. What a problem to have, right?
Oh, yeah. I'd love that problem.
Yeah, it couldn't keep up with the fact that he knew he wasn't going to live much longer. That's one of the reasons why we should mention, too, all of them, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, certainly the railroad tycoons, they're active in donating to the arts. They're active in donating to universities, especially universities that have a medical research arm to them. But the one thing that distinguishes Carnegie is he was directly active trying to promote international justice and world peace. So like The Hague was essentially built by Carnegie.
Oh, really? I had no idea.
Oh, yeah.
Just because that's, if you're in a beauty pageant, the classic answer, if you could do anything, what would you do? World peace. Is it because that it seems like the greatest, that's the holy grail, or is there something more complicated than that? So just curious, is he really that deluded that he thinks he can buy world peace?
This is a tricky question because if we're looking for some lost relative in his own background, a brother who died in one of Britain's wars during this period, there's nothing like that.
I know, there's no direct correlation.
Right. It's a bit of a bird walk, but there is a strange relationship that Carnegie has, maybe strange isn't fair, but he's very much drawn almost magnetically to the philosophy of Herbert Spencer. And Herbert Spencer was a social Darwinist.
Oh, oh, I'm scared.
Well, social Darwinism has a lot of different variants. It's got a lot of different dialects during this period.
If you say so.
I think I'm required by some kind of like professional ethic to point this out. Charles Darwin never, ever uttered the phrase survival of the fittest. That's not him.
But that's social Darwinism, though.
Except what social Darwinism is trying to do is it's trying to take this idea that random evolutionary changes in a given species habitat are going to allow, crudely put, the animal with the longer neck is going to get the fruit off the tall branch and is going to live longer and is going to be more likely to reproduce as a result. And those...
Just why my arms are now long enough where I can reach for the Doritos bag because my ancestors' evolution.
Exactly. And somewhere in the fossil record, there's this short-armed Erin that just never could reach the Dorito bag.
Ah, I feel for her.
But, Darwin never tried to apply that to families, nations, corporations, right? But the social Darwinists definitely did. But then they immediately ran into this kind of internal argument they had to have about, well, what exactly is civilization? You could make an argument that the whole point of civilization is to defeat evolutionary guardrails on our growth and prosperity and capacity for creativity and compassion and justice. Every time you wash your hands, you're kind of saying,
we're saying, screw you, nature.
Yeah.
Screw you, nature. We got this.
Right. Every time you put on a pair of glasses, anytime a given community uses up all the resources of location X and relocates itself to location Y, and builds a train between the two those are all attempts to kind of defeat those Darwinian principles. So from Carnegie's perspective, he took this position that industrialization, scientific advancements, improvements in public literacy and the standard of living, that all of it ultimately, although it might have these moments of pain and people feeling displaced and economically disadvantaged, like the poverty that his father knew, like the dislocations of his own childhood, that ultimately the plane of everyone's existence would improve. And in light of that, he felt that the only real way that progress could be cut short would be if human beings used those same technologies, tools that could allow us all to eat off the same china that the Queen of England was, right? We can all eat off the CV Wedgwood china. It lets you pick up a phone in Tokyo and talk to somebody in Tennessee, right? Conquering sunset, right? When he was a child and the sun disappeared over the horizon.
That was it. That was the end of the day.
You had to light a candle, right? Now we have artificial light, much to the dismay of John D. Rockefeller, who's concerned about what it's going to mean for his oil profits. The thing that can upset that whole process is war, because war is literally about destroying life and treasure in the service of some kind of Darwinian territorial claim.
We use all of our knowledge, all of our skills to build weapons of mass destruction, to find new ways to kill people.
Right.
Essentially.
And that's why when he was working on his autobiography, well, he has a couple of self-reflective writings throughout his life, but when World War I starts, that's it. He doesn't pick up his pen again. By that point, he's in Scotland and he realizes he has to come back to the United States. It's heartbreaking for him. And this is where you get into this big debate is it heartbreaking for him because he sees World War I as like the ultimate rejection of his vision? Because this is a man who actually sat down with the Kaiser.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And by some accounts actually said, is there something I could do for you financially that would make.
Can I write a check?
Can I write a check?
Can I literally write a check? Oh, no.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. So it was like, how can I make it worthwhile to you for not going to war? And the Kaiser said no.
Oh, well, again, it's one of those discussions where it was behind closed doors. We don't know all the details of it, but he met with Teddy Roosevelt. I know we both tend to be Teddy Roosevelt admirers, but Teddy Roosevelt was awfully militaristic.
I think he's going to appear on an episode at some point because obviously there's a lot to love about Teddy. There's a lot to not love. So he's certainly an ambivalent offender.
Yeah, he's complicated too. One theory goes that Carnegie is just cratered in this depression now that World War I is not only underway and is going to be the most mammoth conflict in the history of the globe.
If you're fighting for justice, for peace, now you have a literal world war that has not been seen in the entire world.
What's going to make it all the more bloody? The very tools that he spent his whole life building, mass production, corporate efficiency, improved transportation.
The ultimate irony.
Right.
You can build a center of peace, you can build The Hague, but you also contribute to millions upon millions of soldiers and non-soldier civilians dying in this world war.
Now, the other theory that runs along with that, although we don't have evidence that he ever, lost anyone in his family in a war, which is why we have this other more complex explanation for why he funds all these peacekeeping efforts. But the other side of it is it's a pretty analytically crude approach, but it's compelling. It's is the argument that he actually thinks he might go to hell if he doesn't find some way to set the balance sheet, ironically, the moral balance sheet to the positive side of the ledger. And this is because I think it's in the Wall biography, and it's also PBS did a really wonderful program called The Richest Man in the World about his life. I think it's old enough that listeners should be able to feel bad for PBS, but they'll probably be able to find it on YouTube somewhere.
Support PBS, but yes, you can go YouTube.
It won't be 4K HD, but in multiple sources, it's indicated that when he gets back to New York, the one last thing he can try and do to patch up, I guess, his own karma is to try and make peace with Frick, because some of the most brutal things that were done to Carnegie Steel employees happened at the behest of Henry Clay Frick, who was really acting on Carnegie's recommendations. It's just Carnegie never liked to be around when a union was broken or a strike was suppressed or workers were torn from their unions. The story goes that he sends a messenger to Frick's estate, who's also in New York at the time, trying to see if they can arrange some kind of meeting to discuss the past. And the message comes back from Frick's property to tell Mr. Carnegie, I'll see him in hell, where he knows we are both going.
I don't think there's ever been as brutal a comeback as that. You can't top that.
Yeah, we're not entirely sure it was said, but anything about
Sounds right.
Anything about their history, it definitely would fit.
So do we want to dive more into? I know we're kind of taking Andrew Carnegie as a case study on the robber barons. Do you want to give us a brief outline of his story? We've already touched on a few things. Obviously, we want to talk about Homestead. Is it Homestead Steel, or is it just Homestead?
It's actually Homestead, Pennsylvania was a company town, but not in the sense of the traditional use of that term. Normally, we think of a company town as a community where one employer controls every grocery store, every rental property.
Like Lumen.
Like Lumen or Pullman, Illinois, or Bartlesville, Oklahoma. To a certain extent, Omaha, Nebraska wouldn't have existed without the railroad. The corner of it that I teach in would have been considered a Western Electric kind of company town for a long time. But what made Homestead unique was that it had a deep trade union tradition. Labor was active in politics. Labor leaders were often elected mayor, and they had essentially built the town. So they didn't necessarily see it as like a corporate enclosure where they were trapped. They very much identified with that space. But I guess we are a little bit ahead of ourselves, because as far as Carnegie's life goes, all we really did was get him across the Atlantic over into Pennsylvania.
So he's born in Scotland. We talked a little bit about his dad's life as a weaver and how automation destroys that industry or those craftsmen. And now they sailed over to the United States. What happens then? How does he get to the point where he's obviously ruling a whole industry?
So they land in America in 1848. It's a time where then they're in today we'd call it Pittsburgh. Then it would have been Allegheny, because there's Allegheny County and then there's the Allegheny, I don't know if it's a township yet, and there's Allegheny Mountains. It actually comes to a part of North America that historically has been pretty significant, because not too far from where they settle is where the Battle of Jumonville Glen took place, which kind of started the French and Indian War, which kind of started the 7 Years' War, which kind of eventually led to the American Revolution. And then, just a little bit later in the timeline, you have to drive a little farther. It's about 150 miles away, but Gettysburg is about 150 miles east of where he comes to the United States. So first, he worked in the textile industry too. Even when he was a boy back in Scotland, he hated it. He found it oppressive, and he found the way that the mills were run to be pretty tyrannical and exploitive.
Ironic.
Yeah.
It's like, I'll never be like this. Cut to 20, 30, 40 years later.
Yeah, and he really seemed to struggle with just the physical brutality of it, because children were essentially property. And it was understood that if your children were not being productive enough in the mill, that you might have to strike them,
And kids had horrible injury, get so many disfigurements, losing limbs, whatever.
Yeah.
The work itself.
Yeah. The way I think, if you're a listener and you want to try and visualize this, do a Google search for Gilded Age sweatshop, and then tack on 2 more words, child and photograph. And then if you do the image search,
I'm going to do that right now. Gilded Age, child.
Well, Gilded Age sweatshop, child photograph. Then just tap tap the image tab.
Oh no. There they are.
And I'll tell you, of all the ones that will jump out at you, there's one that's specifically, it says boy working sweatshop, and it looks like they're making boots.
Yep, I literally just landed on that one.
Okay, so do you see the men in the background?
Yep, there's like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 men.
They're just smiling.
Older 20s, 30s men.
They're happy to be photographed. It's like, this is kind of cool. Our work here is being recorded for eternity in a photograph. And you look at that boy, and you look at that boy's face, and it's very obvious that they beat him.
Yeah. Like his left side is blurry, is dark, obviously a bruise. He's probably no more than 9, maybe 8, 9, 10 tops. It's hard to tell.
And if you want to make sure that you can find it as a listener,
I could post it on Instagram too.
Yeah. It's a Jacob Riis photograph, so it's RIIS, and it's the Corbis photo library that has control of it. So if you add that to the search, you're guaranteed to find it. But I always think it's so emblematic of the times. Of course, this is 30 or 40 years after the kind of childhood labor experience that Carnegie would have had.
It really puts things in context. And yet people don't like regulations. You know what's part of regulations? Child labor laws. Sorry, off my soapbox.
Well, the other soapbox we could get on is that we eventually, as a country, it took 2 attempts. We tried to get out of it in 1916, but we didn't really get out of it until 1938. But child labor is still very much a part of our economy. We're all wearing things. We're all using things that were made by kids. We just don't want to have to gaze upon that in our own country.
And sorry, I just took a greater look because when I was looking at the photograph, I did think the kid's face was blurred, but then I look up close and it's not blurry. It's a network of bruises.
Right.
Oh my God.
And what I mean, I don't want to say what I love about this photograph. There's nothing about this photograph to be in any way inspired. In fact, I'm bothered by the fact that the HBO Gilded Age show doesn't seem to ever want to dwell into this corner, just like you'll never see Civil War veterans on the streets in the Gilded Age TV show.
Mm-hmm. But you do see multiple uses of the same horse.
Peanut is subjected to, we shouldn't make light of that either, because they got in trouble for that, as they should have. Yeah. What's the other show we watch? The one it's Napoleonic era Great Britain.
Oh, Bridgerton? Bridgerton?
Yeah, that show. Those horses are treated very well. It's very obvious.
So Matt says, don't watch Gilded Age, watch Bridgerton. If you support horse labor laws, animal labor
Depending
laws.
upon what you're looking for in a show, there are some things that Bridgerton has historically delivered that Gilded Age still on HBO is not.
Hot men. Well, again, George Russell. George Russell is hot.
Yeah.
Objectively hot, playing a Jay Gould type robber baron.
Yeah.
So he's disturbingly hot, but it's hard to compete with Jonathan Bailey on Bridgerton.
I would totally concur. But the whole point of these photographs is that when you look at the adults in the background, none of them have any anxiety or discomfort about being recorded in this kind of environment.
Yeah.
Which always makes me wonder, what do we currently believe? What do we currently hold to be true? What do we, at this time in 2025, take for granted that 50 years from now or 100 years from now, people will look back upon and go, oh my God, I cannot believe you allowed that to happen.
They were okay with that.
Right.
Such is life, such is the world.
We're not going to be exempt from that either. But in Carnegie, what it ends up doing is as soon as he can get any kind of employment that does not involve this kind of work, he latches onto it. And it turns out that he puts himself in a position to rise and rise fast because he gets a job in a telegraph office. And that is an ideal time to get a job in a telegraph office because no large scale economic enterprise, of course, the railroads use the telegraph more than anybody else. Mm-hmm. They all depended upon those telegraph operators. And it put him in a position to know about how were corporate decisions made? How are these big transactions conducted? Who is involved? He made a point that when he would bump into those people on the street, he would say, hello, Mr. X, hello, Mr. Y, hello, Mr. Scott, Tom Scott, the Pennsylvania Railroad entrepreneur, proved to be kind of a real mentor to him. And they're all like, who's this punk kid who's greeting me like we just...
Do I know you?
Yeah, it's like, I sent telegrams for you.
It allows him to be in the room where it happened, so to speak, without actually being in the room.
Exactly. He gets his first job in what we would today call corporate America when Tom Scott brings him on to work for the Pennsylvania Railroad. And I know this will incite a chuckle, but when you play the Monopoly board game, the B&O, the Baltimore and Ohio, the Pennsylvania, the Reading, those were the original monopolistic railroad lines east of the Mississippi River. Before like the Great Northern Railroad was accused of being a monopoly, before the Progressive era, it was these, many of whom were run by the Vanderbilt conglomerate. They were the movers and shakers. And so he learned pretty quickly probably his most important lesson. And this was a discipline he maintained his whole life, which is he was absolutely obsessed with cost reduction. Anything that could be done to cut costs, he would undertake.
Such a CEO.
Right, because railroad is an incredibly capitally intensive business. You have to contemplate this just ridiculous outlay of expenditures, property for the land, the track, the trestles, the bridges, the engines, the conductors, the engineers.
Large startup cost and large maintenance costs.
Right. The brakemen, the passenger staff. And as soon as you do one calculation for a particular route, like, trying to get from Baltimore to Washington, D.C., or trying to get from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, as soon as you get one little regional spur figured out, you begin realizing that, well, if I wanted to do this 2 or 3 more times, I'm going to have to purchase certain things in quantity. And that requires that I have relationships with coal producers for my fuel and steel producers for the rails. And I'm going to have to get some investors who are willing to pony up the cash to start the whole thing. And the math becomes really complex. And it's math that we would today associate with any kind of initial public offering. It's the math that today, it doesn't matter if it's agribusiness or high tech. What I think a lot of Americans don't realize is that the first businesses to ever really have to do that were the railroads. And the way that they had to communicate the real-time decisions, like, what if there's a work stoppage in this rail yard? Or what if there's a collision on this track? Not only how do we deal with that initial crisis, but then how do we account for that as we do long-term planning? While at the same time, we have people who invested in the railroad that are crying out for their dividend checks. 4 times a year, they're supposed to get a cut of the profits. And if you don't have profits to disperse, you have to explain why that is.
It makes my head hurt thinking about everything that has to go in there. I don't know how they did it.
I think Carnegie, to his credit, pretty quickly realizes that the railroad business is kind of volatile because there are people involved at the highest levels who don't necessarily have the long-term strategic best interests of the enterprise at heart. They're just looking to cash out. When he leaves, when he's saved up enough money to start investing in the steel industry, I think he's making a conscious decision that's like, well, okay, no matter what happens with railroad X or railroad Y, they're going to need steel. And as the cities grow, they're going to need steel. This goes back to what we talked about during the first 5 minutes. This is going to be like the central ingredient of the Gilded Age, second industrial revolution. This is why I may one day find myself in a dark room in New York City with Rockefeller and Morgan talking about how to buy the presidency.
Yep.
If that actually happens.
All railroads lead to that.
Yeah, if that actually happened. And so what that meant was there were 2 huge transformations in how steel was produced during this period. One was the Bessemer process, which was developed in Great Britain, that involved injecting oxygen into molten iron while it was undergoing the chemical process that would transform it into steel. And then later on, there was a revision to that called the open hearth process. And they were both pretty radically different approaches to producing the steel. And even though the transformation between the two cost hundreds of thousands of dollars for him to change every mill, to convert every production plant to this, it was the kind of thing that he just did without even thinking about it. Because if a process was cheaper, if there was a way to produce the same product with fewer labor hours, fewer dollars,
he's on it.
He was on it. There were even periods of massive economic downturns, like the Panic of 1893. There were also some rough recessionary periods after the turn of the century. And he consistently just ran his mills 24/7. Because what that eventually allowed him to do was his output was so high that this is the paradox of how monopolies form. When a monopoly is trying to gather momentum and establish itself, it's usually driving prices down. Because the whole idea is that if you undercut your competitors, eventually you can knock on their door and say, look, do you want to keep this up? Or would you like to sell out to me? Then once they have complete control of the marketplace, that's when you see the prices start to spike back up.
You evil villain laugh.
Right. That was his genius. But it did mean at one point in the early 1890s, the steel workers, the machinists, today we would call them engineers, who had kind of made all of this possible and who had pioneered a lot of these techniques at places like Homestead. He did not want to work with them as a unit anymore. It wasn't about wages initially. In the summer of 1892, it was simply about not wanting to negotiate with the labor union anymore.
Mm-hmm.
He conveniently puts himself in Scotland when this decree goes down, but when their contract was up.
Did they say you can't have a union? Is that what it is? Or I'm just not negotiating with you?
Right. He tells Frick to tell the Amalgamated Steelworkers Union and their affiliated trade unions in the area that if you want to come back tomorrow, you're welcome to do that, but I'm no longer going to pay you and employ you based on the terms of this of this union contract, right? Which had provisions in it for how long a shift could be and pay based on seniority, and there were some provisions in there for.
So that's out.
Right.
All that's out. So you can come back, but not on those terms. You're at his mercy.
Right, and immediately, as soon as word of this hits the media, every journalist in America is on a train, ironically, to Homestead, because this should be the epic confrontation. Carnegie had said his whole career that he was not like the other industrial employers, that because of his roots, because of his father's experiences, because of his own childhood, he was a champion of the working man.
I'm not a normal industrialist. I'm a cool industrialist.
Right. I'm on your side, and we'll find a way to work this out. Which is why, to his critics, he made sure that it was Frick who actually had to give the order.
Ball man.
Right. And the workers, this is where it gets sticky. This is where my own students yell at me because they want to know what I think. I don't do that.
You're not going to disclose it here. Well,
probably not.
You might have to disclose a little bit.
Well, from Carnegie's perspective, from Frick's perspective, right? They own the mill. It's their corporation. It's their property. End of story, right? From the perspective of the men who worked at Homestead, their philosophy was, well, it's my intellectual capital. It's my muscle. It's our blood and sweat.
It's just a mill unless there's somebody
Right.
working it. It's just a property. It's just a building.
Right. Because they would argue none of this could exist, not just as a material, physical asset of the Carnegie empire, but also they would argue intellectually the transformation from puddling, the old process of iron production, to mass-produced steel. They would have argued that, well, every evolutionary step along the way, go back to the Herbert Spencer discussion, we are the reason that happened. And in fact, one of his most famous, I don't think he would like to be called a foreman. I think he would have preferred to be called a captain. So kind of an underrepresented biography in this whole story would be Captain Bill Jones, who kind of had that honorary title from his participation in the Civil War. And like Carnegie, he was the children of immigrants from Wales. But he was kind of the technological architect of what we call ET today, the Edgar Thomson Steelworks, that was the plant where Carnegie, it was like a laboratory. It was the cutting edge of industrial production techniques. And it was Jones who figured out how to adapt the Bessemer process to mass production. It was Jones who dealt with all of the workers in terms of who would sort of manage this process, this very dangerous, volatile process. In fact, I saw some research recently that there are probably 40, maybe 50 different patents for industrial production techniques that one way or the other can be traced to Jones.
Good job, Billy. Good job. You're just
Predictably.
inventing everything.
Now, guess how he died?
Probably in some sort of accident.
He died in an industrial accident a few days after the industrial accident. And he dies about 3 years before the Homestead Steel Strike.
It's a huge blow, both to the workers then, but also he's not just labor, but he's the brain of the operations in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and kind of the heart, too, because Carnegie did some things that we would today find kind of silly and Luminesque. If you were the plant that had produced the most steel in a month, there was some kind of prize.
Did he give them a waffle party or dance party? That doesn't sound very Carnegie-like to do a dance party.
During the Jones era, Jones himself may have kind of chuckled at this, but if your particular plant was the most productive, you were allowed to hoist up a steel broom above the entrance.
Okay, that's way more disappointing. I was expecting a waffle party or at least a pizza party or something.
Or maybe some defiant jazz dancing.
Oh, just a frickin' broom? I don't know. That wouldn't motivate me.
And, the deeper irony of it, too, is that it was hoisted up really high and it was made out of silver. So, in some ways, this is the irony of it, is that if you were a worker there, you might have said to yourself, well, gosh, I wonder what that silver broom would translate to if we were to just sell it and get some higher wages, right?
I will say it's a little bit tone deaf, but it's just me.
And they're not idiots. They're very aware of this. But again, kind of going back to that photograph that we looked at, their vision of what's considered to be a fair and equitable workplace is not like ours. They're not in a world where there's such a thing as the Family and Medical Leave Act or a minimum wage or an occupational safety and health administrator. That's just not their universe. But that's not to say that they don't really prize the fact that they have a union, the fact that they have a voice. And they're aware that Carnegie and Frick are bringing in so-called scab employees, often from their perspective, intentionally bringing in employees who don't have to have the same skill set anymore because the process has become a lot more automated.
They've helped
They've helped to do.
Through their blood, sweat, and tears.
Right. But they're an industry where, as late as 1900, 1 out of every 10 steel workers dies on the job every year. I mean, you just imagine that for a second. You're in an occupation where at the end of every year, of your 10 closest friends on the job, one of them is going to be gone and eventually it's going to be you. The one thing they feel that they can use to leverage against that is the fact that they have a labor union to try and maintain some sense of safety or to limit shifts, because obviously a lot of the accidents happen when people are fatigued. But from Frick's perspective, acting on Carnegie's behest, they don't need that anymore. The workers are certainly allowed to come back the next day, but from here on out, they are at-will employees.
If that's their only voice, then they've lost it.
And Frick ultimately, to keep them out of the plant, puts up razor wire, and the employees refuse to abandon the town around the mill. There's this kind of standoff now while Carnegie is conveniently fishing in the Scottish Highlands, pretty far away from any telegraph office. There is a transatlantic cable, so he could check in.
Not suspicious at all.
Right. So by July, everyone knows what's going to happen next is somehow, some way, Frick is going to bring in Pinkerton Guards, kind of America's corporate. They're still around today. The Pinkerton Detective Agency is still around today. And their job is not to take over the mills. They wouldn't know how to run them. But their job is, with their Winchester rifles, to march into Homestead and all the access routes to it and create this cordon for scab labor to come in and then begin the process that will ultimately blacklist all the union leaders and see to it that they not only lose their jobs, but also, right, in theory, they're never going to be allowed to work in the steel industry again. And there's this epic showdown where the Monongahela River that runs by the plant, it sees these Pinkertons delivered under cover of darkness. They try and sail in a barge, and they're spotted, and gunfire is exchanged. It was really bizarre because some of the weapons that the strikers are using are like old Civil War era rifled muskets.
What year is this?
This is the summer of 1892.
Either these men or their fathers would have fought in the Civil War, so still got that stuff hanging around. 7
workers are killed, 3 Pinkertons. The Pinkertons aren't entirely prepared for the fact that they're at war with engineers. So their dynamite is rolled down to the riverbank. That's unsettling to them because they're basically trapped on their boats. They realize we're at war with this entire town, and then oil is pumped onto the river and it's set on set on fire. At that point, the Pinkertons realize, okay, we should probably put up a white flag. It's a very complex situation, though, because the union leaders have been trying to avoid this violence. They've tendered offers to Frick, and they've told Frick, look, get this to Carnegie. We're sure that if he were to see this proposal, he would allow us to come back and maintain the union, because they agreed to wage cuts. They basically said, all we care about is that going forward, we want to be able to maintain our union. We want you to recognize that just as Carnegie Steel is a corporate entity that has these relationships with like the Frick Coal or Coke Company, as it would have been called, you should see us as like a lateral partner.
And they think Carnegie, at least in the past, he's given the impression that he's on their side. Maybe not pro-labor, but he's given the impression that this is fine. We'll work with the unions. I guess in some sort of misguided way, they think that, well, this couldn't be coming from him.
Even though during this time period, there was a mechanism called a yellow dog contract, which was a labor contract where when you signed it, as a condition of maintaining your employment, you agreed that not only would you never join a union, but that if you did the union in violation of this contract, this so-called yellow dog contract, that you would have to forfeit all the wages that you'd ever been paid.
What? So you get nothing. Yeah. Absolutely nothing.
And then some of them actually said you would also have to consent to have your name put on a blacklist where you would agree that you could never work in this industry again.
I think for context for people, we're like, okay, well then get another job. This is the only industry that they probably ever worked in. They have all the skills. Those skills aren't necessarily transferable.
Right.
So it's not as easy as today where it's like, okay, I can't work in the banking industry, so I'm going to go work in education or somewhere else.
Right. It's not a situation where Carnegie definitely had engaged in yellow dog contracts before. In fact, when he got into the steel industry, he studied some other Pennsylvania area steel producers who kind of pioneered the yellow dog contract in that industry. But he had very carefully cultivated this image that to the extent that they were a part of his own corporate empire, it wasn't something he was aware of, or it was rare, or he'd really done a good job of disguising that in much the same way that there was a period where some of the industrial processes coming out of Europe that were a little bit ahead of his own production techniques, kind of post-Bessemer, between the Bessemer process and the open hearth process, there was a stretch there where a few of his rivals were actually ahead of him.
Mm-hmm. Can't have that.
He kind of invented this is something we connect to, we think Rockefeller did stuff like this, not Carnegie, but he invented this whole weird claim about homogeneity, that there was something about the new process that would make the steel that his competitors were selling unreliable, that would make it unexpectedly brittle or dangerous for use in armor plate or skyscrapers.
I'm surprising once he got to it, then it was fine.
Once he got to it, it was fine. And they were aware. In fact, there's a whole theory that this is one of the reasons the Titanic was so vulnerable to that iceberg. Today, we know an awful lot about the metallurgical properties, the tensile strength of different alloys under certain conditions. This is one reason why boilers and steamboats and railroad engine cars would blow up so frequently in the Gilded Age is that they didn't really understand what they were doing to the same degree that we do. But he basically lied until he could catch up technologically. And then during this whole homestead crisis, he's conveniently in Scotland. He's conveniently hard to reach.
How does it end?
All of those men are displaced from their homes. They all lose their jobs. They're all blacklisted. They never work in the steel industry again. The steel industry doesn't really have any kind of union until basically 38, 39.
1938,
right.
39, obviously.
Right. And this is something where Carnegie's defenders would say, yeah, but once he has his labor costs under control and he can start focusing entirely on cost cutting and production, that's the road to U.S. steel. And that's the road to thousands of white collar jobs in management, chemistry. And
they were collateral damage to something better.
Right. And that's also, low cost steel is what gets you everything from the Model T to the Liberty ship. It's messy. Sometimes people think about modern parallels to this, and a great modern parallel to this, to my mind, would be something like Apple, where they want to control everything. Every time you buy a Candy Crush power-up, Apple wants 30%. They build the device. They control the software that goes on the device. They control the retail outlets through which it's sold. They own rare earth element mineral interests in remote corners of the world. They have binding contracts with production facilities in Southeast Asia.
And may or may not be engaging in things like child labor.
Yeah, if you've ever seen some of the Foxconn controversies around some of the production facilities for their equipment. But the whole idea that you must control every element of the productive process, what an economist would call vertical integration. The whole idea that you vertically integrate first, and then you horizontally integrate. Then you buy out your competitors, right? That's the Carnegie model as opposed to the Rockefeller one. That's Walmart. That's General Motors. That's General Electric. He kind of builds that model that becomes the blueprint for the whole 20th century U.S. economy. Love it or hate it, whether you feel benefited by it or terribly exploited by it. But boy, if you're some of those homestead workers.
Yeah.
And the newspapers had these brutal cartoons where they'd show him giving away a library with one hand. He'd be like a giant Carnegie, because that was his nickname, the little giant sometimes. He kind of shares that with Stephen Douglas. They both had that nickname at different times. But he would be giving you a library with one hand, or a university or a hospital or an art museum. But then behind his back, the cartoonist would have him with a knife ruthlessly slashing wages or blacklisting employees. We have that debate all the time.
That's our podcast in a nutshell. Unless there's something else that we should highlight, I think that kind of leads us into, if we want to
do the judgment,
sort of do a judgment piece as we talk about these figures. If you think of that scale model, okay, well, we'll put the endowments, we'll put the world peace, or the idea of world peace, and the museums on one side.
Who goes first?
I think you should go first. It's usually the one who presents, so
okay.
I think you should go first.
Well, if it is the case that Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, Vanderbilt, if they do have modern analogs in the form of a Musk or a Zuckerberg or a Tim Cook or a Tim Apple, as he's sometimes called, and in honor of that parallel, I'm going to go ahead and do like a 51-49, maybe 52-48 tops. I'm going to go ahead and tilt that 51 or 52 towards the critic side, towards the dark side, towards the, I can't quite put my hands together for you, robber barons, or certainly Andrew Carnegie. And the reason I'm going to say that is because the older I get, the more I'm struck by this. It's not that he is of bad moral character. That's why he gets a lot of the points he does on the 40% side of the ledger. Where I struggle with him is that he does not have moral imagination. It is apparently not on his radar that you could find a way to be economically successful, to transform the world through mass production, technological change. It's unthinkable to him, apparently, that you could do that and have a egalitarian relationship with your workers. I'm not talking about some kind of Edward Bellamy or Henry George or utopian socialist.
Just making sure that your workers can feed themselves or not
I
be
like
named.
my iPhone too, and I like my paycheck. I'm a free market person. I have been involved in small business myself over the years, but he just apparently can't come to terms with that. I'm sure if he were still with us, he would grab his famous Ledger A account book and say, well, I can show you 1,000 reasons why.
Well, I'll show you the math.
I can't do it. There's just no way.
See, I'd be like 70-30 bad. I'd be a little bit more. I just feel like everything that,
Yeah.
I mean, this is a personal opinion, but everything that I find the root of America evil.
Now, see, now I'm going to be really evil because you're never supposed to do this in history, but I'm going to pull the counterfactual on you. Okay.
Yes.
Do you want to replay the 20th century without U.S. Steel, the child of Carnegie
No.
Steel? I don't want to go through the 2 world wars without U.S. Steel. Germany would like us to go through the 2 world wars without U.S. Steel.
That is true. That's the 30%. I find it really hard because I also will use as a point that he obviously felt like he was going to hell and he felt like he had to do some atonement towards the end of his life. It doesn't seem like to me that he felt like everything had been above board, that there was some sort of realization there that he had, broken backs, done countless damage to workers.
This sometimes happens where you can make an argument that because his own childhood was so hard, because they did wrestle with poverty, because he did know what it was like to, inhabit the dungeon.
He's not a Nepo baby.
Right.
He could understand the things that his workers and their families were going through, which I think makes him even more evil in a way.
Well,
That it's not like he did not have that as a background.
but I think the question is, when you go through that, does it animate within you later in life an empathy for people in similar circumstances, which is what we would hope it would have done, but apparently didn't as much as we would like? Or does it actually cultivate a sort of callousness where it's like, well, I struggled and now it's your turn, and your struggle relative to my struggle might not be as hard.
Pull you up by your bootstraps. Yeah, that you should be able to do what I did.
When you think about, at various times in this discussion, we've talked about, well, what about an 8-hour workday law? What about banning child labor? What about a minimum wage? What about a requirement that you allow your workers to collectively bargain? How about workmen's compensation? How about employer liability insurance? How about some help with your medical bills? All of those kinds of reforms, we associate those with, to a certain extent, 2 Roosevelts, right?
Mm-hmm. Teddy and Franklin.
Between 1900 and 1945, there's going to be a Roosevelt in the White House from 01 to 09 and from 33 to 45, and neither one of them ever worked in a steel mill or a spun thread.
They're the Nepoist of Nepo babies,
Yeah.
as you said, back to New Amsterdam. Their family, they're the the most patrician of patricians, but they could have empathy. They knew better. Why not Andrew Carnegie?
Guess that'll be a question for our listeners to contemplate.
Mm-hmm.
So have I weaseled out of it enough to, you can't quite, isn't that nice? 51-49. How's that? No?
Yeah, I'll let you off the hook this time. Although as a person who is in a union.
That's true. I
union.
Do proudly belong to a union.
I felt like you might be a little bit less sympathetic to Andrew Carnegie, but you just love the big bosses.
My perspective on that is very simple. If the corporation has the right to spread risk through shareholders, no individual manager is like on the hook for the corporate liability should they stumble. Mm-hmm. Right. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of having shares, is that you're spreading the risk among a pool of investors, right? Well, if they can pull themselves together into a unit to determine how they want to spend their money and the market they want to tackle and the technologies they want to patent and the product they want to sell, if they're allowed and encouraged and given legal blessing to come together as a unit to do things to try and return profit to their shareholders in the form of dividend checks and such, then why can't the other half of the equation do the same thing?
Amen.
That's why I'm a 50-50 person on that. I'm not a communist. It's just, that's the way contracts work. There's a buyer and there's a seller. They each get a paragraph.
We're a pro-union podcast. Yeah. I'll put it that way.
I've noticed, though, if we are a union podcast, I would like to point out that the last time I checked, I don't think I'm getting paid for this podcast.
Well, neither am I.
Do I need to talk to my steward?
Just talk to Billy Jones. He'll help you out.
Oh, okay.
Bill Jones.
Well, in my defense, I don't think I'm dealing with quite the same working conditions that he did.
Got to keep it on the down low.
Right.
Don't tell anybody. I don't have money to atone for my sins with a museum. Not yet.
Someday.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. Hopefully we left you with a lot of food for thought in terms of maybe our current situation.
I see no parallels. Just none.
And I do want to remind everybody again to follow us on Instagram, where you can find reels announcing the new episodes and much, much more. I put a lot of time into creating them.
They look amazing. I love those. Every time they pop up on my phone, they are so cool.
I love doing it. And if you want more episodes, more content, check out our Patreon page as well. That's all linked in the show notes.
Who's coming up? Who's next?
Jamie's going to be returning to the pod to talk Tanya Harding. So exciting things ahead. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt, for walking us through the Gilded Age.
Thank you. I'm happy to do it. I'm reluctant to do it, but you keep finding a way to rope me in. So it is fun.
We love it. All right. Bye, guys.
Goodbye.